What's going on, everybody? We got UFC 304 this week, and I'm going to break down everything that you need to know to make some money playing on DraftKings this week. And I've also placed a few bets for the card that I'm going to go over here. And all I ask while you're watching is to like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel. I build all my lineups using the Stochastic Sims. If you guys do want to sign up for our Sims product, it's really helpful for MMA. It's going to help you weed out some of the lineups that are expected to be highly duped. It's also going to simulate the slate for you 40,000 times, which will also help you identify some of the best lineups. If you want to sign up for that, links are down below in the YouTube description box. As far as a giveaway, which I've been doing weekly on these shows, last week we did one, which fighter in the main event would score the most fantasy points between Verna Jandiroba and Amanda Lemos. And then also, kind of tied together, who would win and how many fantasy points would they score? So it ended up being Verna won. She scored 96 fantasy points. The closest to the pin in the YouTube comments, it was Anthony Arlowski, 8011. He went with Verna with 92. So he was right on the mark there, just a few fantasy points off. So there's the winner that we have. DM me on Twitter so I could hook you up with a free Odd Shopper subscription, our betting site. As for this week, it's 14 cards. There's so many fights to choose from. I want to know from you guys in the description box below, in the comments there, which fighter do you think wins that has the cheapest price tag? So meaning if Curtis Blades was to win at $6,800, and that's the cheapest fighter to win, just write his name in below. So let me know which fighter is the cheapest that ends up winning on DraftKings this week. Let me know that below. Whoever gets the answer correct, or if there's multiple correct winners, we'll do a Odd Shopper giveaway for you guys as well, which we'll announce next week. But let's start breaking down the card. 14 fights. And I'm going to not try to take too much time with a lot of these fights so that you guys aren't taking too much time watching this here. We'll start with the main event, and we have Leon Edwards taking on Belal Muhammad. I do have a bet on this fight. I bet Leon Edwards minus 170 on the money line just as the fight opened up. It's moved a little bit, and I don't really think the current line is all that bettable. But if I did have to take a bet on it, I think that Leon Edwards by decision is at least viable for DraftKings purposes. I do not think this is a very good fight to target. We saw Leon Edwards and Belal Muhammad fight a couple of years ago, and while the fight did end in the second round due to a no contest on an eye poke, I do think the first round was kind of telling, because in the round plus we saw these two fight, there was no takedowns landed. Leon Edwards landed 19 significant strikes and Belal landed 8. Now, keep in mind, there was one completely completed round, the first round. We only got 18 seconds into the second round before the fight was called off. But this is how a lot of Leon Edwards fights end up going, especially during his title reign, as well as his run to getting to the title. He has a lot of fights where not only does he not really put a ton of output out, but his defense is so good that he really mutes the offense of his opponent. So you look at his fight last time out against Colby Covington, where he thought, well, if Colby wins, the path to victory is going to be him landing takedowns. He wasn't really able to do that against Leon Edwards. So the result is each of them land 2 takedowns. Edwards lands 57 significant strikes. Colby lands 44. If I'm not mistaken, we've only seen Leon Edwards score over 100 fantasy points once in his entire career over on DraftKings. There's a lot of fights on this card. I think Leon Edwards wins. I think he wins the decision and probably scores like 80 to 90 fantasy points. That's just not going to be enough for this particular card. And then as far as Belal Muhammad goes, I just don't think he's all that likely to win. And then even if he does win, I'm not sure he's going to score all that well, considering the strong defense from Leon Edwards, like we talked about there. Colby Covington landing 44 significant strikes in a loss against him. Kamaru Usman in their, that was actually the third time they fought. Usman lost, lands 87 significant strikes, 4 takedowns. So even if he won, he wasn't going to put up a great DraftKings score. And then if you look at the second fight against Kamaru Usman, keep in mind they fought many years ago. Edwards wins with the late head kick. We did see Usman have more success in that fight, landing 83 significant strikes and 5 takedowns. Nate Diaz in a 5-round decision only landed 76 significant strikes against Leon Edwards. So I think the winner of this fight isn't going to score all that well for DraftKings purposes, and it is one that's expected to be really popular. So I'm pretty far underweight to the field. I only have 19% of Leon Edwards in my first run of lineups here and 16% of Belal Muhammad. So I'm underweight to both sides of the main event. The co-main event, which is another rematch between Tom Aspinall and Curtis Blades. This is another fight that we saw. Let's see, how long ago is this now? Nearly 2 years ago, exactly. A little bit over 2 years ago, we saw Tom Aspinall and Curtis Blades fight. And I'm picking Aspinall to win. I do think the most likely scenario is that he knocks out Curtis Blaydes in the first or second round. Aspinall, I do think, is the current best heavyweight we have in the UFC. Here's the issue, though. The betting line is absurd. We saw Aspinall and Blaydes fight, and don't put too much stock into the results here because Tom Aspinall blew his knee out, 15 seconds into the fight. So nothing from that fight matters at all, except here's one thing that does stand out to me. Aspinall was a slight favorite, very slight favorite. It was close to a pick'em. And what's happened since that fight? Tom Aspinall has the long layoff due to injury. Fights Marcin Tybur, layup matchup coming back, starches him. Fights Sergey Pavlovich also, starches him in a minute. So, yeah, we saw one good win from Tom Aspinall and one win that we all expected him to have. And then Curtis Blaydes, since the fight against Tom Aspinall, lost against against Sergey Pavlovich, got knocked out in that fight. And then he knocked out Jailton Almeida. I don't think the stock of these two fighters has changed all that significantly since their first fight. So while I do favor Aspinall to win and I'm going to pick him to win, I think this fight should be closer to be like Aspinall minus 150 to maybe minus 180. You can get Curtis Blaydes. The best available line right now is on DraftKings plus 320. Once again, not picking him to win, but just based on how wide the odds are, you got Aspinall nearly a minus 500 favorite. I just think that's way out of line. So I am picking Aspinall to win. I'm going to have more exposure to him in DFS. He's actually currently my most rostered fighter. I have him in nearly half of my lineups. Now, with that said, I am a little bit overweight to Curtis Blaydes. Field not really on him. He's only projected for about 20% ownership. So I love this fight for DFS purposes. I'm going to bet Curtis Blaydes. Actually, already have placed a bet on him, plus 320 over on DraftKings, just because I think the line is too wide. There is one real unanswered question with Tom Aspinall, and that is, what does his cardio look like? Most of his fights in the UFC have ended very, very early. If you look through his career history, he has only had one fight get outside of the first round, and he looked completely gassed in the second round against Andrei Arlovsky. We do know that there's some durability concerns on Curtis Blaydes, so Aspinall could certainly knock him out in the first or the early stages of the second round. But I do think Blaydes probably wins the fight if it gets past the first round into the later stages of the second round. So Blaydes is a live underdog. I'm going to be overweight to both sides of the fight, and I also like the long odds money line on Curtis Blaydes. Bobby Green against Paddy Pimblett. I know Bobby Green officially changed his name to King Green, but I do find it a little bit confusing when fighters change their name, and especially if people are familiar with Bobby Green and they're watching this, be like, who the hell is King Green? So let's call him Bobby Green for the purposes of the breakdown. And I think Paddy Pimblett is overhyped. He is a very good grappler. He's a very opportunistic finisher. He does have power on the feet as well, but not great cardio from Paddy Pimblett and zero defense on the feet. So I think Bobby Green, as long as his fight is on the feet, is going to absolutely box the face off of Paddy Pimblett. I wouldn't be surprised if Paddy Pimblett is just standing in front of Bobby Green for a lot of the fight, and Green's able to land, 120, 130 significant strikes or something like that. I do expect that Paddy Pimblett is going to be the more popular fighter of the two, considering the hype around Paddy Pimblett, and also the fact that Bobby Green opened as a pretty substantial betting favorite for this fight. And as we've gotten closer and closer to fight time, that line has gotten tighter and tighter to the point where now it's a pick'em. I'm really hoping that Bobby Green ends up being plus money. I'm going to end up betting him, but I haven't placed it just yet because I think we could get a better line closer to the fight. But I'm picking Bobby Green to win. I also think it could end up being leveraged. So right now, we have the projected ownership fairly close, 28% on Pimblett, and then on the Green side, 27%. But if this betting line continues to move in favor of Paddy and becomes the betting favor, where maybe it's like minus 130 on the Pimblett side and then plus money on the Bobby Green side, then I do think we could see something like Bobby Green come in at like 22% ownership and Pimblett around 35%. So I'm going to be overweight to Bobby Green. I'll be underweight to Paddy Pimblett, and hoping we get a plus money price to bet on Bobby Green as we get closer to the fight time. Next fight that we have, another one that should be really good. This is a great fight card. 14 fights, like we said at the top, but also a lot of these should be action fights, including Gregory Rodriguez against Christian Leroy Duncan. Now, of these two fighters, Gregory Rodriguez has massive advantages, especially in the wrestling and grappling. Christian Leroy Duncan only defends takedowns at a 50% clip. We've seen in the past that when Gregory Rodriguez goes to his takedown game and then is able to get top position, he submits guys and he looks dominant from the top often. Here's the problem, though. He doesn't like to. he lands 2.46 takedowns per 15 minutes, but it's almost always as a survival tactic for Rodriguez, where he gets hurt and then he kind of has to shoot a takedown. But he really prefers to just stand and trade with guys. And we've seen fights where he's had massive advantages in the wrestling and grappling department, and he just doesn't go to it. He just prefers to stand and trade on the feet. So, for example, the fight against Bruno Ferreira, if Rodriguez looks to shoot takedowns in that fight, he probably wins that fight easily, but instead he chooses to stand and trade against a really powerful striker, gets himself knocked out. The only time we've really seen him go to his wrestling early was against Dennis Tuolulin. Took him down immediately. Was just able to ground and pound and finish him. But there have been a lot of these other fights, like even the one against Julian Marquez. I know that Rodriguez won that fight by knockout and was able to hurt Marquez multiple times on the feet. But he wins that fight almost every time if he looks to wrestle. And time again, he has not done that. Armin Petrosian, another guy, striker, zero wrestling defense, zero ability to grapple. And Gregor Rodriguez largely decides to stand and trade with him in that fight and gets outstruck on the feet. So if Rodriguez decides to go and wrestle, I think he probably submits Christian Leroy Duncan. Looks like a big favorite. But I think instead what happens is he chooses to stand and trade on the feet, and then you get a competitive fight. And on the feet, I do favor Christian Leroy Duncan. But every single Gregor Rodriguez fight, it is high action, high pace. He gets in his opponent's face. He looks to brawl. So with that being the case, I do think the winner of this fight should score really well. I have over 30% of both Duncan and Rodriguez in this matchup. Next fight that we have here, it is Arnold Allen against Giga Chikadze. This should be a pretty simple win for Arnold Allen as long as he comes in with a good game plan, which I do suspect that he will. Giga Chikadze, who has not only taken a lot of damage in some of his fights, in particular, the one against Calvin Kattar, where we saw Kattar land, you see here, 144 significant strikes, also knocked down Giga in that fight. And it was one of the most one-sided beatings that you will see in a 5-round fight that ends up going to the distance. Giga, incredible durability to be able to survive that fight, but he clearly looked outmatched, and that is something that has been a concern for me going forward, is how is the durability of Chikadze going to look past that fight? In addition, though, he only defends takedowns at a 69% clip. He struggles to get up after he's been taken down. Arnold Allen isn't necessarily elite in any one category, but doesn't have any weaknesses, other than the fact that his output isn't crazy high. But he's a good striker. He's a good wrestler. He's a good grappler. He's a good defensive wrestler. He also is somebody who is just overall fights really smart with good game plans. So what I think is going to end up happening here is Arnold Allen is going to be cautious when they're on the feet. He's going to look for entries to get takedowns. And I think that as long as he's able to land 2 takedowns in this fight against Giga, he's going to get himself a decision win. And that's what I think ultimately ends up happening here. Maybe Arnold Allen is able to get himself a submission. If that's the case, then he could be a viable contrarian option. I currently have him in, let's see, not that much. I only have 11% of Arnold Allen. He is only projected for 16% ownership. There's other pay-up options I prefer to Arnold Allen. So I'm not going to say that he isn't complete. If somebody said that they had Arnold Allen in a lineup, he's not my favorite fighter. I wouldn't say you have to take him out. It's just hard to prioritize everybody on a 14-fight card. So I wouldn't be stunned if Allen is able to submit Giga Chikadze. I just hope it doesn't happen based on what my DFS lineups are going to end up being as I prioritize other pay-up options. But I'm pretty confident that Arnold Allen ends up winning. Nathaniel Wood against Daniel Pineda. Daniel Pineda is a very good fighter, but unfortunately he's only good for like 4 or 5 minutes, and then the wheels completely come off. So the way Pineda fights go is he's very live in the first round. In fact, if you are somebody who's going to be backing Pineda in this fight, just bet him to win by first round finish, because if he doesn't get that first round finish, he's going to lose. It's pretty close to what his money line is. It's his only path to victory, in my opinion, is a first-round finish. And Nathaniel Wood also does have some durability concerns. So I'm going to take some shots on Pineda in GPPs, especially the really large field tournaments. But I have to pick Nathaniel Wood to win, and probably by a second-round finish, because time and time again with Daniel Pineda, if he does not get those early finishes to materialize, the wheels just totally come off, and then he either gets finished late or he just gasses out and loses the decision. So Alex Caceres, he ended up beating Pineda in a decision. Pineda was winning the early rounds. Wheels fall off. Caceres takes over late against Tucker Lutz. That was actually a fight where Pineda was able to get a second-round finish. With that said, though, he was starting to gas a little bit in the second round of that fight. No contest against Andre Fili. With that said, Andre Fili was absolutely destroying Pineda. in that fight, especially in the later stages of the first round. Here was another fight. Daniel Pineda looks okay in the early going against Cub Swanson. The wheels fall off. He gets KO'd in the second round against Herbert Burns. This was a hilarious meme fight where just two guys with shitty cardio, and Herbert Burns just quit in the second round. But anyway, as far as this fight goes between Nathaniel Wood and Daniel Pineda, I think it's pretty binary. Pineda either wins in the first round or he doesn't. He gasses out, and Nathaniel Wood either ends up winning in the second or third round. The only issue on the Nathaniel Wood side is that he is very expensive. He is $9,500 on DraftKings. So I have 26% of him. The price tag does make it a little bit difficult to get up to him, considering how many high upside targets there are on the high end. So like Nathaniel Wood, going to pick him to win by second round finish, but I am going to get to other high price fighters before him just because of that $9,500 price tag. Couple of fights coming up where I do like high-priced fighters. Molly McCann against Bruno Brazil. And there are a bunch of fights on this card. Keep in mind it's taking place in England. And I do think that the UFC is trying to market the local fighters by giving a lot of them very easy wins. Like Molly McCann against Bruno Brazil. We've seen what the UFC does with Molly McCann for these fights that take place in England. They give her very favorable matchups in the hopes that she wins impressively and builds up her fan base. When they give Molly McCann more difficult matchups, she generally doesn't look very good in those spots. We saw her get destroyed by Erin Blanchfield. Honestly, she probably should have been able to beat Julia Stolyarenko, but she looked pretty crappy in that fight. This was another fight that took place in England, the fight against Luana Carolina, and Molly McCann put on a great performance and had one of the best highlight KOs you've ever seen from a WMMA fight. And I think we could see something similar in this matchup against Bruno Brazil. And I don't really typically include a ton of narratives into my breakdowns, but it's very clear that Molly McCann feeds off the energy when she's fighting at home. And it does kind of change her performance as well as her output, like especially a fight against Luana Carolina. I think that's a really good kind of example of what happens when Molly McCann is fighting at home, where she has the fight won pretty clearly, but she did not stop hunting for the finish, even in the third round of that fight. So I think that she's going to be looking to take Bruno Brazil's head off from the very go of this fight. And considering she has advantages everywhere, a lot more output, she's the better wrestler, she's the better grappler, she's the better striker. I think she should win this fight however she wants. I do think she ultimately ends up getting a decision, and she's not all that popular. We only have Molly McCann projected for 19% ownership. There are some pay-up options I like getting to differentiate some of my lineups. Molly McCann is one of them. I currently have her in 38% of my lineups, way overweight to the field. That's only rostering her in the teens right now. I'm not going to be playing Bruno Brazil. I don't really take her chances to win this fight very seriously. The next fight that we have here, Jake Hadley against Callum Loughran, and very odd what ended up happening at weigh-ins. At the top of the show, I mentioned that everybody made weight, with the exception being Jake Hadley. Jake Hadley is moving up from 125 pounds to 135 pounds now, and he missed weight. The only fighter who didn't make weight is a guy who is not fighting at his normal weight class where he's fought most of his career. And even fighting down a weight class, Jake Hadley only defends takedowns at a 35% clip. And what we know about Loughran is that he is somebody who looks to wrestle and grapple. He lands 2.5 takedowns per 15 minutes. If you watch his fights outside of the UFC, he's very aggressive, both on the feet, but particularly looking for his takedowns. Just like what I said with the Molly McCann fight, where they're trying to get the local fighters really good matchups to win and potentially look impressive. I think that's what's happening with Loughran here, where I think that he is going to have no issues taking down Jake Hadley with his 35% takedown defense. And considering also that Loughran is as active as he is on the feet, landing north of 6 significant strikes per minute, I think he's another really good pay-up option. He's expected to be somewhat popular, 27% projected ownership, so nothing like crazy chalk, but somewhat popular. But I'm still overweight to the field on that, just because I think this is such a good stylistic matchup on paper for Loughran. I think he wins, and I think he puts up a big score, even if it goes to decision, because of how easy it should be for him to land takedowns in this matchup. And then also, he's going to have a big physicality advantage over Jake Hadley, with Hadley coming up to 135 pounds. While they are about the same size in terms of height, one thing that we do definitely see between the two, if you compare their frames, Loughran is the much thicker and bigger athlete. So I think he's going to be the stronger, more physical of the two. Should be able to land takedowns and put up a pretty big DraftKings score. Modestas Bukauskas against Marcin Prachniow. This fight should suck. Both of these fighters are very low level. They're very fringe UFC kind of talents. And typically they're not finishers either. Even though they both fight at 205 pounds, you can make a case that, like, hey, these guys aren't going to be all that popular and they're fighting at 205 pounds. Either of them could end up getting knocked out. There is some truth to that, but it's just not all that likely to me. If you look at Marcin Prachniow, his last time that he had a finish in the UFC was back in 2021 against Ike Villanueva, and Ike Villanueva doesn't belong anywhere near the UFC. So we just don't see finishes from Prachniow all that often. And then on the Bukauskas side, we have seen him not with a finish since 2020 against Andreas Michailidis. And that was the weird fight where, if you guys remember, where at the end of a round, Michailidis was like kind of sitting up against the octagon cage, and then somebody opened up the octagon, so he fell, and the ref thought that he was knocked out because he fell over. So he calls off the fight at the end of the first round. So even that finish was a very, very bizarre one. I think this is going to take place on the feet and is probably going to be a fairly low output striking match with a lot of leg kicks being thrown. I think the winner scores like 75 fantasy points and isn't going to be all that important for the winning lineup. So another fight that I don't have all that much interest in. Oban Elliott taking on Preston Parsons. This should be another really good fight, and one that really good fight in terms of watchability. I don't really rate either of these fighters particularly highly. I do think that Preston Parsons should win and put up a pretty big DraftKings score. So Oban Elliott, we saw him fight on the Contender Series. He gets a majority decision win. I wasn't all that impressed with the performance, but then he had a lot of hype coming off of it into his UFC debut against Val Woodburn. And I thought Oban Elliott looked terrible in that fight. Val wins the first round, knocks down Oban Elliott, nearly finishes him in the first, but Val Woodburn has like 3-4 minutes of cardio. So what ends up happening is he knocks down Oban Elliott, nearly finishes him, has some success in the early going, and then gasses out, and Oban Elliott wins a kind of unimpressive decision, kind of like in his fight on the Contender Series. He wins, but it's a majority decision. Didn't really look all that great. One thing we could say about Oban Elliott is that he is fairly aggressive. He does look for takedowns. He does move forward a lot in his fights, which is the same thing you could say about Parsons as well, who's very aggressive looking for his wrestling. He lands over 4 takedowns per 15 minutes. And when you consider some of the other opponents that he's had, I mean, the win against Matthew Semelsberg, he landed 7 takedowns in that matchup. So if he's able to land 7 takedowns against Matthew Semelsberg, who I do think is potentially a better wrestler than Oban Elliott, I think we could see a fight here that plays out kind of similarly to that. I do think that should Elliott win, he would put up a pretty big DraftKings score, so I'll have some exposure to him. But Preston Parsons is going to be the higher priority for me. I currently have him in 40% of my lineups. He's one of my most rostered fighters on the entire card. And then I have Oban Elliott in 19% of my lineups. Something else that I like about rostering Parsons, we have Elliott projected for 31% ownership to 24% on Parsons. So not only do I pick him to win and think he would score really well in a win, but we're also getting leverage because Oban Elliott is projected to be one of the chalkiest fighters on the card. Moving on here, we have Muhammad Mokaev taking on Manel Kape. This is another fight that I have a bet on. I'm betting Manel Kape on the money line. I think this is really close to a pick'em fight, and we're getting plus money odds on Kape. He's right around a plus 150. Let's see what the best available line is at the time that I'm recording this. I bet him at plus 146. And right now, the best available line on Manel Kape is plus 142 on DraftKings. So plus 145. Sorry, misread that. Yeah, so plus 145. That is currently the best available line on Manel Kape. Anything plus money, in my opinion, is good odds on Manel Kape. I really do like Mokaev as a prospect. He's just very young and very green. So Mokaev is currently only 23 years old. He's a lot of room to improve. I do think that he's somebody who's ultimately going to end up becoming a champion. I just don't know that it's for sure going to be in the short-term future. If you look at some of the fights Mokaev has been in, yeah, he's undefeated, and overall the results have been good in the UFC. When you get into some of like the actual details of the fight, so he looked good against Alex Perez, but a lot of it was because Alex Perez was so focused on defending the takedowns that he just didn't put a lot of offense out. So Mokaev kind of won just by spamming takedowns in that fight. In the fight against Tim Elliott is winning that fight. He won the first 2 rounds on the judges' scorecards. If it goes to decision, Tim Elliott wins, but Muhammad Mokaev ends up getting a finish with just a couple of minutes left in the fight. Against Jafel Filio, Filio gets Mokaev in a nasty leg lock, nearly finishes Mokaev. He is able to gut it out, but I mean, nearly destroys his knee while doing it. A lot of fighters would have tapped. So we know Mokaev is really tough, but once again, it's a win where he ends up scoring okay for DraftKings, but it wasn't an overly impressive performance against Malcolm Gordon. He gets a finish against Malcolm Gordon in the third round, but finishing Malcolm Gordon in the third, that's a negative finishing Malcolm Gordon in the third round. Even if you look at Malcolm Gordon, and I think he's since been cut, but Jimmy Flick finished Malcolm Gordon in the second round, and Mokaev wasn't able to do it until the third round. So once again, I like Muhammad Mokaev, and I think he's a really, really great prospect. The problem I have with him is I think he's a little bit overrated in this spot. And when the fight is taking place on the feet, Manel Kape has a massive striking advantage. Where Mokaev really, really excels is in his wrestling. He's relentless. He's a really good grappler as well. But Kape does defend takedowns at a 77% clip. We've seen him fight a lot of high-level fighters that have struggled to take him down. He's going to be live to finish Mokaev at any point when it's on the feet. And then in addition to that, if the fight goes to the judges' scorecards, Kape is going to win. Muhammad Mokaev, because of his inability to do much damage striking, is not a great minutes winner. So I think that Manel Kape probably should be a slight favorite in this fight, which is not what the line is. As far as DFS, it's kind of funny. I do think that even though I'm picking Kape to win and I'm betting on him, I do think there's a little bit more upside on the Mokaev side, just because if he wins, it's going to have to be by spamming takedowns. So at the $8,400 price tag on Mokaev, if he wins, he probably ends up scoring like 80, 90 plus fantasy points, maybe even over 100. So I do have more exposure to the Mokaev side, even though I'm picking Kape to win. Now, with that said, Mokaev is projected for over 30% ownership, and I am underweight to the field on him. The next fight we have here, it is Sam Patterson against Kiefer Crosbie. This is another one of these fights that I view as the UFC trying to set up a young local fighter in a favorable matchup for a win. Now, this could go wrong for Sam Patterson. Really, any fight could go wrong for Sam Patterson because he has terrible durability and striking defense. He is very prone to getting hit hard and knocked out, and Kiefer Crosbie does have big power on the feet. But outside of that early first round finish, this is Sam Patterson's fight to win. If he's smart, he's just going to look to wrestle. He's a big grappling advantage. We did see him win by submission in his last win, or I should say his last fight, which is also his last win against Johan Lioness. So if he comes in and looks to wrestle, I think it should just be an easy win for Sam Patterson. I'll take some shots on Kiefer Crosbie just because of the durability concerns on the Patterson side. Now, with that said, I think Patterson is one of the best contrarian plays we have on the slate. He's only projected for 12% ownership. A big reason the field is scared of him, I think, is because we're aware of what his durability concerns are. So I think people are looking to go to other pay-up options because they're concerned about, like, hey, if Patterson gets chin-checked, then I'm going to roster this $9,300 fighter who might score like less than 5 fantasy points. But if he comes out and wrestles and puts up a big score, he could really differentiate a lineup. So I'm going to get aggressive going overweight to the field on Sam Patterson. As long as his ownership projection remains this low, I'm going to get overweight to the field on him just to differentiate some lineups. If he does win, which I mean, he's like a minus 400 favorite, he should win. I think he also scores well and probably finishes Crosbie in the fight. Next fight, it is Mick Parkin against Lucas Bresky. These next two fights aren't all that interesting to me. This is a low-level heavyweight fight. The good news here is that they do at least keep somewhat of a pace. We've seen Bresky at times put up a pretty good amount of significant strikes. In his loss to Martin Buday, which was a ridiculous loss, he should have won that fight, he did land 118 significant strikes. So in a fight that goes to decision, you can see both these fighters landing over 100 significant strikes. And if it is competitive on the feet and they're both putting out a lot of output, then I do think you can make a case for Bresky being a live underdog. He is also projected for very low ownership. We have Bresky coming in under 10% ownership. So it's $7,100. I think this fight should be pretty competitive. He's live to win a decision. And with that being the case, you could see a scenario where we end up getting Bresky scoring, 70, 80 fantasy points and in a decision win at his price point, that could be good enough to get him into a winning lineup. So as long as he also remains really low owned, I'll take some shots on him, but not a priority play. Wouldn't play him in single entry. And if you guys are playing like 5 to 10 lineups, probably wouldn't have Lucas Bresky in any of them. No interest in Mick Parkin as a pay-up option. He is too expensive for what I think is pretty low upside for this fight. The only reason that Bresky gets consideration is because of the low ownership and the low price point. And now finally, we have the opening fight on the card, Shauna Bannon against Elise Ardelane. And these fighters, neither of them belong in the UFC. The fight is also just ridiculously long odds to finish inside the distance. So this is a fight that should go to the judges' scorecards. And then also you have a fighter in Shauna Bannon. I mean, we just saw her fight in her debut, and she was a somewhat significant favorite against Bruno Brazil. I don't even think Bruno Brazil belongs in the UFC. And in that matchup, we saw Brazil win pretty handily, 30-27, 29-28, 29-28. Significant strikes were 56-54. The fight was terrible. I think this fight is probably going to be more of the same. For DFS purposes, I would much rather roster Artelane just from the standpoint of she's much cheaper of the two. And, you know, if a cheaper fighter ends up winning, that's always going to be decent for DFS purposes. But on the Bannon side, she's $8,900. I know that she's not popular, but that's not enough for me to end up rostering her. So not a fight that I'm liking. It is my least favorite fight on the entire card. That's also how we're going to start it. So overall, it should be a great card. Just the first couple of fights might not be quite as great as some of the other ones. That is going to do it for us, guys. I did try to get through it as quickly as I can while also getting you guys good information, so you're not sitting here for like an hour and a half having me break down everything. If you want to sign up for the tools on the site, get access to our ownership projections, our fighter projections, our top fighters tool, which gives you odds of fighters scoring 100 plus fantasy points and odds of them being in winning lineups and things along those lines. All the links to sign up for everything are below. We've also got our sims tool. You could build your lineups on our site, you could simulate the slate. So check that out, link down below. Other than that, guys, thank you very much for watching. Like and subscribe if you haven't already. Enjoy the card. See you back here next week.